This talk was recorded for St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father Jim Basic.
In this series of lectures, we're talking about the whole topic of conversion. It seems really important to reinterpret that notion of conversion so that we see it as operative in our own lives. Unfortunately, the term conversion has often been thought of in an esoteric sense to apply only to people who undergo sudden and reversals in their lives, striking kinds of religious experiences. And I'm very interested in bringing back that term so that it can apply to all of us, so that we can all understand some ways in which we need to be converted in our lives, in which we can end up doing better, in which in one way or another we can improve. To do this, I've been looking at different aspects of our character and our personality, different dimensions of our existence. So I've talked about an affective conversion in which we need to learn how to mobilize our emotions so we can follow Jesus Christ in a more wholehearted way, with feeling and with depth. We've talked about an intellectual conversion in which we try to move away from a mere common sense way of understanding life and learn how to come up with a theology, a philosophy, a worldview that really helps us to understand who we are and where we fit in the world. And now I want to talk about, on this occasion, a moral conversion. And as usual, I want to try to bounce off of a particular story. I often say that I learn more from the people I interact with than all of the books that I'm forced to read in my pastoral ministry. And I often ask the people who tell me striking stories whether they care if I share them with others. And so on this occasion, I want to tell a story of a particular fellow. I'll use the name Dan for him. And Dan has had a rough life as he's tried to work out his marriages. He's been through 2 failed marriages. In each case, he's been sincere about trying to work them out, but they have worked. And as I've interacted with him over the years, that it's often been seen to be a failure on the part of his spouse that has caused this. He's tended to dominant blame on his part in each one of these relationships. And now he finds himself in a new situation, related to another woman, contemplating marriage, and trying to figure out this time how he's really going to make it work. And so I thought that he better be serious about all this and really go back and examine why his marriages failed. And he was sort of moved by the Scott Peck's book on the question of love. He discusses, this is the road traveled, where he discusses what real love is all about. And in reading that section of the book, he was reminded a lot of the New Testament teaching Jesus when he talked about selfless giving in love. And he began to look back on his previous marriages, in fact on his whole life, and he really figured out that in all of those relationships, really looking out for himself. It was almost a mathematical way of viewing it. He was wondering what was he going to get out of it. If he ever did anything for his spouse, it was always in terms of, will I get back? He was very interested in maintaining his own peace and keeping something reserved for himself. And he found out that in all of his relationships, he had always acted like that. It was his own self-interest that counted. Very often his pleasure, very often just maintaining his own time frame and space so he would really invade. He began to think that he had never really opened up his entire being, his whole psyche and personality to any other human being in his life. And he made a decision, saw that he wasn't going to let this happen in this relationship. And so he began very consciously to try to deal with the new woman in his life in a different way. He went out of himself. He tried to think of her needs. He found himself doing small things for her, of really trying in one way or another to reach out to her, to be generous in his responses to her. He tells stories about how when she was very taken up with a whole lot of work, and he offered to go out and buy presents for that she had to get for other people. And he said after he did that, he said it was strange behavior. He had never agreed to do anything like that before, never decided to be that generous in his response. And he found really a great deal of satisfaction in all of this. Life began to look a little different to him. He said he was relating to people in a new way. He described how in the past he had seen, as he traveled the path of life, he had left a lot of bodies strewn on the journey, people he had simply hurt. and in one way or another had put down or not responded, who wasn't present to them. Now he was really trying to do it in a new way. He was trying to be self-giving and to care for the others. He was making their needs his primary interest. And that really changed things for him. It really turned it around. And what he found to be so remarkable was that he felt better about it. He found a kind of satisfaction that he had never known before in his life. He said life looked different. He found he was a professional man. He found out that his own work as a therapist was really going far better. He was more empathetic in dealing with the people. He understood their problems and so on. He says that he doesn't feel as though he's arrived with all of this. It's like, in a way, he's a beginner. In a sense, he said he almost got hooked on this kind of thing. He became just addicted to trying to do for others and to reach out to others. And he feels as though he has so much further to go with all of this, so much more to learn. He had a pattern in his life that was very destructive, and he can only seem to gradually dismantle it and begin to construct a new way of dealing with people, a way based on love, of a disinterested kind of love, an unselfish love, of going out of himself and reaching out to other people. Well, I see this really as a classic story of moral conversion, a contemporary version of the kind of thing, I suppose, that many people can buy into or can check out or can understand something from that story of what moral conversion is all about. I want to go back and look at a classic work to try to analyze this. And this is the work done by William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which he wrote back in the beginning of the century, 1902. It really is a classic work on religious experience. He describes mystical experiences, the ordinary experiences of people. It is still valuable today for trying to understand ourselves in greater depth. And part of what he does in that book is to analyze the conversion experience. And he defines it. He says conversion is the process, gradual or sudden, by which a self hitherto divided and consciously wrong, inferior, and unhappy becomes unified and consciously right, superior and happy, in consequence of its firmer hold upon religious realities. Now that really is an excellent definition of what conversion might be all about. You see, it changes a person's outlook. They become different. They see life in a brighter way. They are happier because they've changed, because they've made a decision and they've taken some sort of religious reality or higher moral ideal and put it in the center of what they are all about. Now, one thing to notice about all of this, that it is a decision. I think very often conversion should be seen that way. It's a decision to take responsibility and to live according to a new ideal. It's a decision that gives us sort of a new normative frame of reference, a new way of looking at life, a new story that begins to guide us, new principles that determine how we act. It's a whole new worldview that one takes on as a result of this decision to be morally converted. Now, William James says that really there are two types of conversion. One he calls volitional, and that's what I've been describing there. Volitional is where there's a clear decision to do better. It's like Dan in this particular example. He just said, I can't live this way. I mean, why go into a third marriage and blow it again? I have to figure out a better way to relate. And then he consciously read a book and consciously decided to act in the way that it described love in that book. The road less traveled in this case. So that is clearly volitional decision. And then he talks about another kind of conversion experience, which he names self-surrender. And here he believes that what is happening is that there is an unconscious process going on in which we are gradually thinking we shouldn't live this way. There's a new way to live. There's something different about what should be going on with us. And then there is some point in which we sort of let go or surrender, and that unconscious decision that's been percolating beneath the surface of our consciousness comes to the fore, breaks out in sort of a sudden movement to live in a better way. I remember a woman describing that to me. She had been away from church for years, and she had put in her mind that she didn't really miss it, that it wasn't important to her. And but all the time she was sort of something going on. There was a vague disquiet over a period of years. And then suddenly one day she was driving by a church on a Sunday morning, and she just, almost without knowing what she was doing, just stopped the car, got out, went into the church, and began to make whole reversals in her life as a result of this movement. She said it was a very unbidden kind of thing. It just happened suddenly, seemingly without any thought or decision. But when she looked back at it, she could see that indeed there had been something going on beneath the surface. She'd been missing something of her religious tradition. She had gone downhill morally and wasn't happy about that. And so a whole lot of things were going on with her that made her say, or made this decision sort of jump out when she surrendered. Well, a lot of times William James tells us that fatigue is involved in this, that we sort of just, in a moment of exhaustion or a moment of coming to our wits' end, or when we feel like we're hanging by a thread, when we can't handle it anymore, we're sort of exhausted mentally and psychically from the battles of life, is part of when this might happen. That very situation of fatigue could be a catalyst for self-surrender. So when someone finally says, I can't handle this, this is too much for me, I just can't deal with this anymore. And that's when this unconscious decision that's been percolating all along can rush out or come to the fore, break into consciousness, and then people can make this moral kind of conversion. And after they do it, of course, then there is, William James says, there will be this joy, a deep felt joy in the heart, a sort of state of assurance, as he says. All worry is gone. The mystery of life becomes clear. The world looks new and different, and a sort of ecstatic happiness is produced. This is the very kind of feeling that Dan talked to me about, where he was saying that he feels so much different. He feels better about himself now. He finds a joy in giving to others that he'd never known in life. It's deeper and cleaner than anything else during his sort of hedonistic days and self-seeking days that he ever had experienced before. A much richer kind of feeling. Well, William James is helpful in looking at the conversion experience, trying to understand what is going on, and it leads us into trying to take apart a little bit this moral conversion and to look at it from various aspects and to try to see again what it might tell us. Now, I think that a lot of people are not going to say that, well, I'm just totally morally unconverted, I'm living a dissolute life, I'm a horrible sinner in every way. Some people hear it that way, but a lot of people hear it more in terms of, well, I'm trying to lead a good life, I call myself a Christian, I go to worship regularly, I'm trying to follow out the gospel mandates and so on. But even in that kind of situation, it's important, if we're going to hear this, to say, yes, but I'm not perfect. Yes, but I have a way to go. Yes, I have my faults, however, limitations. I have ways in which I disappoint myself. I don't live up to my ideals. The gospel ideals are so high, the message of Jesus so demanding, that I have to admit in my daily life that a lot of times I don't make it. I just don't do everything I should do. So unless we feel something like that, some sort of gap between our ideals and our actual performance, we probably can't get into this moral conversion. Put in the terms of Bernard Lonergan, who's given us those general principles to live, in which he told us to be attentive to our experience and to be intelligent and insightful as we deal with our experience, and to be reasonable in making judgments. The fourth level of that, he said, was to be responsible. So to live morally in a converted way would mean that we are trying to be responsible people, live in that fashion. Now, I'd like to take just a little bit of a break here at this time and allow people to begin to feel their way into the question. And it's time for a little personal examination, I suppose, in one way or another, so that the rest of it begins to make more sense to you. So that I'd like you to look at some of those dark spots now, or invite a sort of examination of conscience where you think there might be need for moral conversion in your own life. You might look at the faults and failings, the limitations, the sins, all with the mind. It's not in a morbid sense, like, boy, I'm a crummy person, but in a sense that, well, I can do something about this. If I know what the problems are, then I could move forward. If I am in touch with my vices, I can move towards greater virtue. If I know my sinfulness, I can ask for forgiveness and rely on God's grace to do better. So I'd invite just an examination of conscience along that line now, in preparation for the kind of things I want to say throughout the rest of this talk.
To take time for reflection, turn the cassette player off. Resume listening when you are ready.
Now, I want to look more carefully at this whole moral conversion experience and to pick it apart a bit, analyze it. So the first way I would look at this moral conversion is a movement from legalism to a generous love. Now, it's really become commonplace in the contemporary theology and in the post-Vatican II church to speak against legalism. We knew legalism in the church as a matter of just simply following rules. I suppose the remnant of that yet today is our rule that we are to worship on weekends, to keep holy the Sabbath day, to get to Mass, and that for many of us that becomes a legalistic practice, that too many Catholics still find themselves going because they're afraid that they're going to go to hell if they don't, or that there is this church law and they'll be looked down upon if they don't keep it in one way or another. So that was a type of legalism that still is at work in our Catholic community. We find people who come to church and don't participate, they don't get into the Mass, they're not wholehearted about it, and it's probably in part at least because they are there just out of keeping a rule and going through the motions, meeting an obligation. I suppose there's other ways, however, in which the legalistic mentality is more subtly present. It's been common as well to talk about the parental tapes that we carry in our heads out of a particular school of psychological thought and therapy, that we have reminders of what our parents have taught us. It's the superego in Freudian terms. In other words, it is possible to live morally simply out of peer pressure, simply out of social convention, simply because it is the way that our parents taught us to do it, because there are certain expectations that our family or our relatives have about us. So it's not out of inner conviction, but simply because it's expected somehow. So I think a careful analysis here would be in order of expectations. For whom do we perform? Who are we trying to please in our lives? The problem, of course, with all those kinds of legalisms is that we end up in a minimalistic morality. It's always, well, what do I have to do, and how far can I go before I violate this social taboo or this religious law? It ends up in a very limited kind of morality, a minimal thing. It's also very negative often. It is a matter of not breaking rules, of keeping laws. It doesn't talk in too positive kind of a way. I often think of it as walking on a tightrope where one is constantly fearful that one will fall off, fall into mortal sin, fall into the clutches of the angry God, fall into the hellfire. So it is sort of a minimalistic and negative approach to whole of the moral life. Now, to be converted from that legalism would mean that we would now act out of love, that we would act out of conviction, out of what is in our heart. Now we would be trying to respond generously. This is exactly what Dan found in his own life. He was so surprised that it wasn't hard to do things for others. He'd spent his whole life resisting that, building a shield from trying to do for others. And now, when he's doing it, he finds himself wanting to do more. He has become generous in his response to other people. He now doesn't keep track anymore of what he has done and wondering what he will get back in return. It's not counting the cost or adding up figures. It is flowing out of a conviction and out of a love that moves him to reach out to others, to appreciate others, and to do for others. My mentor, Karl Rahner, the great German Jesuit theologian who died in 1984 and has written so much in many areas of theology and also has made important contributions to the area of morality, has made the statement that love is true to itself only when it's prepared to give more tomorrow than today. I find that to be a telling statement. It tells us about the nature of love, that love really is always calling for more. That's one of the reasons why it's hard to make this moral conversion, because one is fearful that if I begin to act out of love, there's no end to it. I'll always have to be doing more. And there really is a certain truth in that once we open ourselves up and try to be generous in our response, people will at times take advantage of us, and people will call upon us to do more. There's no doubt about that. And yet the true love experience is, the depth of love says that we have to always be ready to do this more. Now, we might ask ourselves how we're going to try to move in this direction. Well, if we look at the example of Dan that I gave, he moved in that direction by reading a particular book, The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck. Some people find that by reading the New Testament they would be moved in this direction, to read about the example of Jesus and how Jesus calls for a generous love, that might somehow work. It's also possible, I suppose, to ask ourselves why we do things. So the Catholic who's going to Mass just out of obligation could get in touch with that. Do I really think I'm going to hell? Is that a good motive? What if I wouldn't go for a while and just see what that would mean to me and see if I could come up with better motivations for going? In other words, there might be a certain experimentation in the spiritual life that might be called for here. It might be necessary to work out a more adult relationship with parents, for example, a more mutual and equitable kind of relationship. I'm often telling college students that. They can't just always live as doing what their parents want them to do just because they don't want to offend them. Eventually they have to become adult and to try to relate to the parental figures or any authority figure in life in a more adult fashion. Now let me go to another way in which we might try to understand all of this. In this I will term this way, that to be converted morally means to go from a do-your-own-thing morality to responsible behavior. We often call this antinomianism. That is, the feeling that there are no rules, no principles that we are to follow. Many people who have been through a legalism move in this direction. They say, well, I don't want to just follow rules, and I don't want to just live out of parental tapes. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to create my own values. And we find people who have lived sort of responsible lives for a long time, maybe in marriages, suddenly chucking the whole thing and saying, I'm going out and now follow my own whims. I'm going to look out for myself. Now, I do believe that there is something to be said for that. I mean, for example, I know many mothers who don't care for themselves, who simply are giving all the time and have never thought about their own well-being, their own education, their own future after the children have left the home, and they really do have to attend to themselves. And that's not exactly what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a situation where people are simply acting in a totally autonomous way as individuals and not getting any wisdom from the past, picking up nothing from their religious tradition, just abandoning all that, going in their own direction. So to be unconverted is to live in this do-your-own-thing state of morality. However, when we begin to talk about conversion here, we can talk about it as a movement towards responsible behavior. It's living out Lonergan's idea of be responsible. There was a book by H. Richard Niebuhr called The Responsible Self, in which he worked out a whole morality along this line, where we had to see ourselves not as autonomous individuals, but as responding to many factors in life, being in dialogue with many other people and tradition and our great God, and trying to be honestly in conversation, trying to respond in a responsible way to these various calls. So, for example, one would be responding to the call of God in this. One wouldn't say, I just make up my own rules, but one would hear the moral imperative, would hear the call of God echoing in conscience in that secret sanctuary inside of ourselves where we are at home with our God. And we would listen to that. The morally converted person would be trying to pick up the clues, discern the signs of the times, discern the call of conscience that is coming from the great God. To be responsible means we would be responding to the needs of other people. We would take those seriously, the needs of the people around us, our neighbor. We would be taking the command of Jesus to be seriously, that we are to love our neighbors and that we are even to forgive our enemies and love our enemies, so that all the people around us would have some sort of a claim upon us. We would say, yes, in a way, I am my brother's and sister's keeper. I do have responsibilities to loved ones, to family, to my neighborhood, to the people I work with, and so on. Must respond to their needs also. We would be trying to be responsive to the gospel imperative of charity. You know, that Jesus' whole call to be loving and to respond in that way. We try to be responsive to the wisdom in our tradition, so that if somebody says to me, well, I just think that I should do my own thing in the whole area of sexual morality, and just if it feels good, I should do it. Well, then I need to call to their attention a long wisdom, a tradition that's been built up in the Judeo-Christian world that says that sexuality has to be lived out responsibly. It has to be done in accord with relationships, with the needs of others. It has to be done without hurting others. Trying to create a better situation. It has to be done in charity. So in all those ways, we would be trying to move to a converted position of responsible behavior, a responsible kind of freedom. That's a word I don't think we hear enough of these days, responsibility. And the world needs a good dose of that, I think. And of all people who ought to be speaking about it, it is we who inhabit the Judeo-Christian tradition, where it is put in dialogue form. God calls us by name, and he expects a response. We are to be faithful to the call of God. So the whole of the Scriptures are written in that dialogic framework, a conversation between God and human beings. We ought to see the root importance of being responsible, of being responding people to all of these calls, especially to the great God. No, we might ask ourselves, well, how would we move in that direction? How would we try to get that clear for ourselves? Well, one thing might be to reflect on how our behavior affects others. One of the things that Dan told me that was so striking was that business of the body strewn along the path. He really began to get a sense of how he had hurt the other people, how he had been unfair in the way he related to them. I think he's moving to a stage where he feels he needs to ask forgiveness from those people. He understands that part of the breakup of the relationship, not entirely, but part of it was his fault, and he had hurt other people. So when the clues I get out of that is that maybe we should be asking ourselves, well, how does our behavior impinge on others? To get our antennae out a little bit and see how others are responding to what we're doing and what we're saying. And especially to see how we might be hurting people through insensitivity, through ignoring them, treating them as non-persons, by letting our personality dominate, perhaps. We'll end up putting other people down. All of that needs to be factored in. So what I'm looking for here is sort of a critical self-awareness slanted towards how is my behavior destructive or hurting of other people. And I believe if we began a little examination of conscience along that line, then we would be moved to greater responsible behavior. Now let's look at still another aspect of this whole business. And this I'm calling the moral conversion, looking at it as a movement from a privatism to a developed social conscience. Now, that privatism suggests the whole way of looking at ourselves and our world. It might be epitomized in the statement that I'm going to save my own soul. Now, this isn't just a do-your-own-thing morality. This is one that says, I have to get myself to heaven. You know, that the sins that I'm concerned about are almost entirely private. It is based on a whole outlook on the spiritual life that is entirely vertical. That is, that I see my relationships, the importance of growth in life in vertical terms, an upward movement towards God. God calls me as an individual. I have to respond to that call. It ends up setting up a morality very often that involves personal goodness, but no real concern for the social dimension. A privatistic morality doesn't care about politics or about economics. It's the kind of piety that doesn't want to hear sermons in church on the peace pastoral or on the economics pastoral of the bishops. It has no room for the social message of the gospel at all. The morality is almost entirely a matter of saying my own prayers and getting my own self to heaven. We might extend it to family life, but not much beyond into the economic, political, and social realms. That was what I would mean by privatism, and I think this is a great problem today. I mean, there's so many people who are caught up with this kind of problem. It's become sort of the dominant mode in our society. It's based on an individualism. We have a number of authors these days who have analyzed this for us very well and pointed out that it's sort of the great limitation of our society today, that we've lost the sense of the common good, and that people are almost entirely zeroed in on this business of looking out for themselves, even though they might do it in a very laudable way and with great moral conviction. Now, to be converted along this line means to move towards a developed social conscience, that our consciousness has been raised and we now see the ramifications of sin. Sin would be seen like dropping a bit of ink maybe on a blotter to take an older image that then just sort of spreads out. We would see that sinfulness invests institutions, it infects social systems, that the world can be messed up, that structures can end up hurting other people. It begins to get a sense that there is this what we call social sin, that individual sin gets embedded in structures and systems. That's an advance that's been made in our own Christian understanding these days. The liberation theologians have helped us to see it, and it really is a crucial matter, I think, in trying to move forward towards a more converted moral life. The positive side of this would be that we are to see that love of God has to issue in love of neighbor, that the person who says they love God and hates their neighbor is a liar, that love of neighbor has to mean that we want good for them, and it extends to the oppressed, the marginalized, the people in our society who can't make it, who can't get hold of themselves, all of the poor who feel powerless in the world, that a social conscience would be oriented to that, to say, how can I help them? So we would see charity, if we were converted in this way, we would know it's not just enough to give a food basket at Christmas, but that we need to be concerned about the laws of our country, that and the way we prioritize our budget and so on, that these are part of Christian concerns, that we have to influence our lawmakers to try to make sure that the least well-off in our society find some sort of protection. We have to do something active to promote justice and say no to injustice. Can't sit on the sidelines. I'm reminded of Thomas Merton's title of his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. The guilty bystander is us in many ways, that we can't just look and say, oh, this is terrible that we've got 7% unemployment, or that so many people we know are now hurting, or that the gap between rich and poor is getting bigger. That we can't just stand on the sidelines, that we have to get involved and do something. Now, that takes us to the how of this. And, I think that for many people, they develop their social consciousness by getting involved in a particular issue. So that some of our collegians who go down and help feed people at a local food distribution center and actually encounter those people, begin to see how the poor feel powerless and how they're entrapped in a situation. They begin to see perhaps that we have to do something about that. I think that today many people feel it's important to join a voluntary organization that tries to help the poor in the world. We could think of Bread for the World as a classic example of a group that tries to lobby Congress in order to try to help feed people around the world with the idea that changing in one law really is going to be very helpful in feeding people, more helpful than maybe all the voluntary contributions we could come up with. So that one of the principles we might say along this line is that every Christian person today, if they're going to be converted morally, ought to join one voluntary organization to work for peace and justice and reverence for life in our world. And I believe that in doing that, what we do is learn about it. These organizations always have newsletters, and they put them out, and they tell us about the problem and enable us to educate ourselves as we go along, and then they give us concrete directives like when to write our congresspersons, what to do about it. So that might be one of the hows, the methods for moving from an unconverted privatism to a converted position in which we have a developed social conscience. Let me take up another area here, and that is the movement from vice to virtue. Now, these are helpful categories. Vice suggests destructive patterns, habitual ways of acting, which end up hurting others. Vices involve us in blind spots, an inability to see what is going on and how we might be hurting others. Vices cause dissonance within us. They often cause us to be fatigued so we can't function effectively. So that a particular person is perhaps because they just have become habitually attuned to hurting others. They're just bitchy all the time, sarcastic and cynical in their remarks. That becomes their character trait, and it ends up hurting people. But to be converted along this line means to move to virtue. Now, virtue, as we might define as an assured capacity to respond well in changing circumstances. Virtues are crucially important. We have a whole renewal of this in moral theology today, a recovery of the importance of virtue. You know, it is a way through repetitive action, which includes insight of figuring out how to live better. This is what Dan is doing now. He's habitually acting in a new way, reaching out, being generous. He's understanding what he's doing, and by repeating it over and over, it's becoming a habit. He is acquiring a virtue. In this way, our strengths are integrated. We're able to act now as a full person out of this new center of consciousness, as William James described it. When we have virtue, then it becomes effortless, and we delight in doing the good action. Now it comes easily. We don't have to push ourselves, we don't have to grit our teeth to say we're going to do the right thing. Now it flows. It's become like a second nature to us. Now we end up rejoicing in the good. Now we notice the needs of others, we respond to them, and we end up feeling good about it. Well, how are we going to become more virtuous people? Well, the discipline becomes very important, and repeating the action. Some people think that's sort of out. They think that they don't want to do that way. They want to be more spontaneous. But I believe there comes a time in our life when we have to say, no, I must do this. I really have to live in this way, and I'm going to force myself almost to do it. There is a discipline needed, I believe, in all of this. And then I believe it would be helpful to be attentive to small matters. Just for example, if I tend to exaggerate a lot, well, I can come up with a vice that I'm always exaggerating. But maybe if I check myself and I say every time I exaggerate and I recognize it, I'm going to admit it and say, well, wait, it wasn't 50 people. It was really only 10 who were there. And by saying that and constantly catching myself before long, I end up saying the correct things the first time around. Now let me move to a final way of looking at that, and this is to move from principle to story. Now this becomes a little more subtle, but there is a whole school of thought these days that says that the highest form of morality is to act on principle. We get this out of Kohlberg's studies, stage 5 and 6, where we are to act out of principle. So we say that peace, for example, is a high value. Then I make a decision that I will work for it. It becomes almost bloodless in a way, or dispassionate. In other words, the highest norm of morality is seen to be this sort of dispassionate, cool person who acts on principle. Now, there's something good about that, but it also needs to be critiqued. There's a higher stage. Carol Gilligan, in her book In a Different Voice, has told us that there is other ways of making moral decisions. So we might end up thinking about it of living out an appropriate story based on immersion in a community. So that, let's make this concrete. I wouldn't just be a peacemaker because there's a principle to do so, but I'd decide to be a peacemaker because I'm fortunate to live in this country, because my parents preferred conflict resolution to forceful interaction, that they taught me that, and so I'm going to live out that way. That I'm going to live this as a peacemaker because the bishops of my church are striving to move us in this way. They're stressing the importance of this. Because I have a feel for the next generation, I'm going to be a peacemaker because I want the next generation to live without this nuclear threat. I carry on because at my regular worship services, when I go to Mass, peacemaking is stressed, and we share a greeting of peace. I do it because I admire other people who are peacemakers. So I keep going because my religion tells me to do that. This is the right thing to do. I remain a peacemaker because I love my country, because I'm patriotic. So all of those ways, you see, is rooting morality now in story, in narrative. I do it not just out of principle, but out of all these factors that have shaped me. I think if we're going to do this well, we have to reappropriate our tradition. We have to remember how we're immersed in communities. We have to draw on the wisdom of our church and nation and so on. So we've been talking now about moral conversion. We looked at stories, and we see how that could move us to do better. It really is an invitation to move from the hard heart to the soft heart that is responsive to the great God.
All rights to these talks are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210. This talk was recorded for St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father Jim Basic.
In this whole series of talks, I've been trying to discuss the notion of conversion. And the more I talk about this topic, the more I'm convinced that it really is a good tool for increasing our self-awareness and producing greater growth in the spiritual life. As I talk about that, we have to remember that conversion is not simply something that we do on our own. This is not an autonomous action. All of this has to be seen in the light of God's goodness to us. Grace always precedes our own actions. God takes the initiative. We're able to make progress in life always because God has graced us, because God's Spirit is with us. It's important to remember that so that we would not end up thinking of conversion as something simply self-directed or accomplished by our own means. So we would be patting ourselves on the back and saying, boy, I'm really intellectually converted or affectively converted, or I've turned my life around morally, and that I would become proud about all of that. It's important to keep that theological point in mind, that conversion is always God's doing, that it's the work of the Spirit, that we are being responsive somehow to this call of God. It's God's initiative that makes our progress possible. And now I want to move towards religious conversion, or more specifically, Christian conversion. And again, as always, I want to begin with a story, and I want to talk about a particular individual who I think represents, in a modern context, this kind of religious conversion. Again, I find that it's flesh and blood examples that often move me. I find myself often inspired by the people I deal with. I often think that that's one of the great blessings of ministry, that I get to encounter a lot of people who are serious about the spiritual life, who are struggling, and even in the midst of all the failures, I often run across people who have made it and who have ended up doing better. I seldom record the stories, I guess, of those who have failed or I haven't been able to help. It seems like we come up with a lot of success stories. It's important to factor in that that's often in the midst of a lot of things that don't go that well. Maybe the failures or the successes end up sticking in my mind in a way. But they also are important to me because I believe I really learn a lot from them. And I must say I'm often inspired by the people who don't seem to be very successful but who make a tremendous effort at it. That's one of the blessings, I think, of ministry. So I want to talk about a particular woman by the name of Sue. Sue, I think, was a woman who was ahead of her time in many ways. Sue grew up in an ethnic neighborhood, in a Catholic family that put a lot of emphasis on the Catholic tradition. It was a very conservative religious family in many ways. And Sue was a very bright young woman. And Sue went off to the university and began to get a feel for being enlightened. She wanted to join the super culture. She wanted to break away from a lot of the ethnic customs and the religious faith of her parents. I think she felt in a way that it was sort of unenlightened or childish to be a part of that religious and ethnic tradition. And so she began to think for herself. She became critical of all of that. She consciously distanced herself from her parents. It hurt her parents in many ways. They didn't understand what she was doing. Sue made new types of friends. She associated with a lot of atheists and free-thinking type people. She went off and she sort of really rebelled against her family almost entirely. She had little to do with them. After she graduated, she went out and traveled around the country for a while. She was a very adventuresome kind of person. She really experimented with all kinds of things. I'm not even sure all the things she was into, but she really was looking around for new experiences, and she was just going to be her own person. And as a part of all of that, she really needed to reject her religious heritage. That whole Catholic tradition she grew up in, she just quit it. She quit going to Mass. She didn't follow the particular rules of the religion. The moral principles and the gospel and so on meant very little to her. And she tasted a lot of life in this way. And the time came when she felt a need to sort of reinvestigate that religion. She came knocking on my door one day, coming back home in a sense, and saying, I really have to rethink all of this. I want to re-examine my Catholic faith. I want to look at it again. She says, I've had all kind of problems as I've gone through this. I've been to psychiatrists and so on. And she said, finally, I figured out I don't need a psychiatrist. I need a spiritual director. And so Sue and I began to work together. I got her some things to read about what was going on in the church. I tried to get her to start going to Mass regularly. I got her into a small group of people where she could talk openly about her faith and her personal struggles and so on. And we began to talk about all of this, and it was very slow, and she felt estranged from it all at the beginning, and she didn't really rush back into it that wholeheartedly, but she really did give it a chance. And as time went on, she found herself gradually changing. She started to get more out of the Mass. She began liking to go. She felt bad when she missed it, as though something was lacking throughout that day and week. She began to learn more about her Catholic faith. Surprisingly, she learned more about its weaknesses and its mistakes, and she had to deal with things like crusades and inquisitions in our history and so on. But at the same time, she began to develop a greater pride in that Catholic faith. She even began to come back to some of her ethnic traditions. In fact, she began to relate to her parents in a new way now. I think she would say today that she had a far greater appreciation of the wisdom and strength of her parents than she ever had before. She found herself reading the scriptures periodically, and that they really helped her to achieve a greater self-understanding. She knew who she was in a deeper way. She was really able to locate herself in her world. She found that some of those stories in the Bible spoke directly to her. She heard them in a new way that she'd never imagined before. She heard them not in a childish, infantile way as she had done it in high school, but really now as an adult. And she found that it illumined her experience and really helped her to make sense out of her life. Christ became more real to her. She was able to say, even after a time, that she felt a type of personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That wasn't her real language, and she didn't stress it a whole lot. But if you asked her, she could say, well, yes, I do see him as an important person, and I do see his teachings as part of what is my life is all about. And her work, again, was transformed. She liked to talk of herself now as an instrument of the Spirit. That language came very simply to her and easily. She thought of the Spirit flowing through her. A lot of times when good things happened, she was able to help people and so on. She felt that it wasn't even her doing it. It was somehow God's grace, or she liked to say it, the Spirit flowing through her. Well, here we have an example, I think, of a real religious and Christian conversion, something that is worthy of greater analysis, and we need to look at and try to pull apart in a way to try to get a hold of it. Now, in general, if we would talk about a religious conversion, and you could have this to Judaism or within Islam or Buddhism or any religious tradition, it really would mean that one would have reappropriated one's tradition, that one would have gone from a childish outlook on one's tradition or a rejection of it to a reappropriation, taking it on again now in an adult manner. It would mean that we would go from sort of a half-hearted response to our tradition and to the call of God to a wholehearted one. It would be moving from an eclipse of mystery where we are out of touch with the mystery dimension of life to a greater awareness of mystery. It would mean moving from superficiality to being grasped by something we might call ultimate concern, something that we treasure as a finality, as of ultimate consequence for us. It means moving from a life of drifting to a passionate concern for holiness. We could think of this in terms of the traditional theological virtues, so that a religious conversion would mean that we now had greater faith in the source of all of the goodness in the world, that we would have figured out that we're not totally autonomous, but we hand ourselves over. The converted person religiously would easily say, "Thank you, Lord, for the sunshine, for the people, for any of the good things that go on in life." There would be a greater love in the heart, a love of the mystery, a sense that the mystery of life is gracious and can be trusted, that we can hand ourselves over to that gracious mystery. That mystery allures us and draws us into the future and brings us to a goal even beyond our imaginings. It would mean that we would be people of hope, that indeed we could achieve that kind of fulfillment one day, that the mystery that's in front of us will make sure that we get there, that if we let go, we will fall into gracious hands. So to be converted religiously means we take on with greater seriousness these virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Now, all of that can be put into Christian terms as well. And in Christian terms, it would mean that we were going from sort of a vague understanding of Jesus Christ as an ethical teacher to a life of dedication to the risen Christ as the final prophet and the absolute Savior, the true liberator of humanity. It would mean that Christ would become really important to us and become the center of our lives. He would become the cosmic Lord, the Lord of the whole of creation. And again, in general terms, we could say that we would have a new precept to follow. As we've been going along here, we've learned a lot of those. We learned to be attentive to our experience. We learned to be intelligent or insightful about that experience, to look for patterns and for connections and relationships in our experience. We learned to be reasonable so that we would make good judgments based on insight. So we would first try to understand things and then only then try to judge the truth and falsity of things. We learn to be responsible, to make a moral conversion, that we are to be responsive to the call of God and so on. And here we might add a fifth general principle, and that is to be loving. Because religious conversion finally means to fall in love with God, to give oneself totally over to God, to not only to fall in love with God, but to be in love with God, or to stay in love with God, to somehow have an appreciation of this mystery that surrounds us. So the precept would be that we should be loving people. Now again, I need to take that apart a bit, I suppose, and to try to analyze it in various ways. Let's start out with one of the elements that I talked about there, and that is the whole notion of an eclipse of mystery. That's one of my favorite phrases, happens to be part of a title of a book I wrote called Apologetics and the Eclipse of Mystery. And that notion of eclipse of mystery, I suppose, has been important to me throughout all of my theological reflections, because it tells me something about the problems in our culture, that indeed when mystery is eclipsed, then we don't have a good way of talking about the realities that really count, like love and freedom and sin and failure to respond to our God. We don't even have a way to talk about the great God. So unfortunately, in our culture, very often we simply are in a position where those good things are covered over. We aren't in touch with them. We don't notice them. The mystery dimension of life is simply not part of our habitual way of seeing the world. We're looking out for number one, or we're trying to make a living, or we're working hard, or we're workaholics, or we're escaping in one way or another, or we're centered in on ourselves, or we're out of tune with nature. We don't know how to handle freedom and so on. All of those ways, mystery is eclipsed for us, simply unaware of the graciousness of the mystery that surrounds us. Now, it would seem to be religiously converted would mean that we develop an abiding awareness of the mystery dimension of life. Incidentally, when I'm using that word mystery, perhaps I'm very familiar with it, but maybe others aren't. One way of getting at what I mean by that word is to distinguish it from problem. A problem in life is something that's solvable. We had the problem of getting to the moon, and we put a national effort into it, and we figured out how to do it, and we landed a man on the moon. We have all kind of problems in life. Mysteries, on the other hand, are those things which are essentially incomprehensible, which are inexhaustible, which are not solvable in principle. So, for example, death remains mysterious. We don't know what it is. We don't know for sure what lies on the other side of this whole process of death. It will always be mysterious. I mean, you can put it in problem terms, like how are we going to freeze bodies or something. But the real existential question about death is mystery. So the word mystery to me connotes that which is beyond all comprehension, beyond total comprehension. In some ways we know the mystery of life. There's clues to it. It reveals itself to us partially in nature and through other people, especially for us through Jesus Christ. But we can never get finally a hold of it. It remains inexhaustible. There's more love connected with it than we could ever experience or respond to. So I'm saying now that to be religiously converted means we would get an abiding awareness of this mystery dimension of life. We'd get attuned to the signals of the mystery. We'd be able to see the graciousness in the sunshine and in the suffering people in our world. We'd even be able to see it in our failures, the mystery shining through our limitations, our faults, our sinfulness, so that we wouldn't have to block those out and restrict those and put them into a zone of silence. We'd be able to bring them forward into the light, confident that God can speak to us even within our own sinfulness. That's how far this whole awareness would go. So we want to become more aware of the mystery dimension of life. Now, how are we going to end up doing that? Well, that's a very good question, I suppose, and it is a key question for modern times. One thing we could do is to try to get a better outlook on time. That is, we need to pause and look. When I'm talking to someone, I can be distracted and simply have my mind roaming to other places, or I can try to concentrate on the person I'm talking to. I can try to really listen to them. And in doing that, perhaps I begin to appreciate how the mystery shines through this other person. So the first element here of this whole conversion I want to talk about is this movement from an eclipse of mystery to an awareness of the gracious mystery that always surrounds us. Let me move to another one here as well. And this would be to move from a life of drifting to a passionate drive for holiness. Now, the whole drifting problem is one where we don't take hold in life. I'm thinking of a middle-aged man that I talked to who told me that for ever since that he graduated from college, he has not had serious thoughts about anything except his job. Ever since he graduated, he got into a job. It's been all-consuming for him. It's dominated his life. It's, I think, in some ways really hurt his marriage and his relationship with his kids. But his statement was, I haven't thought of anything with seriousness except my job since I graduated from college. This is a man who is drifting along in important areas of his life. He hasn't developed theologically. He hasn't worked on his relationships. He's simply let it go. Now, it would seem that we could end up drifting like that in many ways. Some of us would say, well, I drift in my moral life. I don't ever ask myself in a serious way, what are my vices and what virtues would I like to have? Some of us drift intellectually. We don't read books. We don't go to lectures. We don't stay up to date with the world scene. Some of us drift emotionally. That is, we simply won't face some negative emotion that really scares us. Maybe it's our anxiety about death. We simply won't deal with it, and it's always tomorrow, I'll get at it later on. And years go by, and we never do anything about it. This is something of what I mean by the whole drifting problem in life. Now, to be converted religiously would mean that I would now become passionate about holiness. Now, the word holiness, I suppose, might put some people off, but holiness suggests to me, first of all, the great glory and power of God. To talk about holiness does not, first of all, mean piling up merit, maybe in much background. To talk about holiness means that we've learned to submit to the great God, to surrender to the mystery that surrounds us, to believe passionately in a higher power, to believe that that power can help me to become my better self. So when we were be holy, we wouldn't be treating God like a kindly old grandfather, but we would be seeing God really as extremely important for us, that God is someone to be taken with ultimate seriousness, that this God not only cares for us, but is demanding as well, that we get both of those elements in there, the awesomeness of God, the almost scary side of being in God's presence, but also the fascination that this God is gracious and cares for us. So to be, I suppose, holy would be that we let ourselves fall into the hands of this God. We would take this God with ultimate seriousness. Now, how are we going to achieve all of this, I suppose? How are we going to move in this direction? Well, I think this whole analysis of our failures would be an important thing. I think that's why Sue would be a good example in all of this. So Sue is one who I think came to understand this in a new way. Sue was drifting along in her life and not doing much of the constructive nature, and then Sue was able to make a decision. She's going to come and knock on my door and say, I need to start over. That probably was the key decision for her to achieve this religious conversion. In a sense, it's a spirited action. It's a letting go. It's sometimes Sue said, I can't handle this all myself. I need to get back into this religion. I need to look at all this. She had to look at the messiness of her life. And I believe that we get a clue there. I believe it has something to do with self-honesty, with being able to say, I could start over, that my God won't imprison me in my past failures. Maybe a lot of religious conversion doesn't happen because we wallow in guilt, because we think we're crummy people. We get down on ourselves. We feel small and insignificant, and we think that maybe even God can't forgive us because we can't forgive ourselves. And religious conversion occurs when we're able to say, no, my God's better than that. The love of my God is stronger than all of my sinfulness, and there is a new chance. I believe that might be part of this religious conversion that we need in our lives. We have to trust, in other words, that God really is in control of this whole process. Well, I think this might be a good place to stop in this whole presentation here, and to allow some time for reflection. You know, I realize there's a lot of words here, and I'm throwing out ideas rather quickly, and the important question is, can we assimilate them or let them strike through to our mind and heart? So I believe it's good to stop periodically and to try to get hold of the whole thing and to ask those personal questions again. You know, in what ways have I drifted? In what ways is mystery eclipsed in my life? In what ways do I need to become more loving and to hand myself over to God? In what ways have I violated that great principle that I must be a loving and committed person? Why don't we take a few minutes, or opportunity at least, for this? You might want to do it personally. Reflection, might want to write a few things down. That often helps. Might want to talk to one other person or in a group and try to respond in one way or another to this examination of conscience on religious conversion.
To take time for reflection, turn the cassette player off. Resume listening when you are ready.
Let me now take up another aspect of this religious conversion that I'm talking about. Now, I'll term this a movement from a half-hearted attitude towards one's religious tradition to being wholehearted about it. I suppose a lot of us would not be in as great a rebellion as Sue was in relationship to her religious tradition. Some of us might have gone through that. Some people might be in the midst of it now. But there's a whole lot of other people who are immersed in the tradition. They simply would say, well, yes, I'm a Catholic and I go to church and so on, or I'm a Lutheran and I try to follow out the tenets of my religion. So the question would become not where we would totally reject the tradition, but living with it in a half-hearted way. That could happen in a lot of different ways. One would be where liturgy and life would be unconnected. That is, I would go to Mass or to worship service and end up walking out and being a beast or dealing poorly with the family. I'm thinking along this line of one family where the wife told me she hated to go to church on Sunday with her husband and the rest of the family because somehow he must not have wanted to be there, because when he would come out, he was a bear. He was just terrible to deal with. And she thought especially it was bad if the homily was ever on social justice matters. Then he was really upset. So that, and she would just go in there hoping that wouldn't happen. Well, there's an example of where living and life are not working together. Somehow they're not synced. For him is a drag, or it's not helping to live as a person at all. So we'd have to ask ourselves, perhaps, or take the message of the liturgy out in daily life, or think about and when Thursday week, when starting to run energy, does it ever make a difference in aspects of lives? Or you could look at it the way, when I go to Mass, do I bring myself to that? Do I tend to offer God my efforts, my struggles, my joys and sorrows of life? Is it a personal kind of experience? At the end of it, do I say, well, I just went through the motions, or it happened, or I got that done? I think that would be one of the worst ways to think about that, is to go and walk home and say, well, that's over with. It's done with. I've accomplished it. It's like this obligation that I've gotten through. So to be half-hearted about our religious tradition would mean that we haven't found a way to link up our personal existence, our everyday life, with that time of worship. And maybe it would extend even into the life of prayer, where we'd say our prayer is even disconnected with what really lies deepest within our heart, that it doesn't have anything to do with our daily concerns. This would be a half-hearted attitude towards one's religious tradition. Now, if we try to move in a more positive direction and say, what are we going to do? Our ideal now becomes to be wholehearted about our religious tradition and what lies at the center of it, of the whole thing, the love that God has for us. Now, in this way, we would try to let the whole symbol system that our religion is to guide our lives. Now, liturgy and life would be connected, so that I go to church and I pick up a good idea and I try it in practice through a week. I look forward to Mass because it focuses my attention. It's like a stop act where I can bring all that I am, my struggles, my joys, my personal desires, hopes, and so on, my cares for others, and I can stop all action for a while and in a more leisurely fashion offer it up to God, hand it over. And I hope to, out of Mass, somehow lift up, energize my focus in order, my priority rate, so I can live effectively throughout the week. That would be liturgy and life, I think, are coming together, where I become a hearted person. John talks about conversion as moving from dark to light. I'm able to look at my life in that way. I'm able to see there's demons that are darkness in the shows. My anger, my frustration, my envy I have to look at that envy, pull it out of the darkness and into the light. That's what John meant by saying that the light shines into the darkness. The light of the gospel helps us understand things better. This is what it might mean to live wholeheartedly out of the religious tradition. You see what I'm trying to say is the tradition now shapes our consciousness. It becomes the grid through which we look at the world. These beautiful stories in our religious tradition begin to be part of what shapes us and moves us. See, we can go on with that. We can look at Augustine and say, here's a man who turned it around, who was living sort of as a general playboy, who had a mistress and an illegitimate child, and he sits down under the tree and he reads the stories out of the gospel, and he reads the Apostle Paul, and it's changed for him. He's like flooded with a new peace and light, and he goes out and he witnesses this. He gets baptized. He becomes a bishop and one of the greatest theologians that's ever lived in the history of the church. So we hear those stories. We hear modern stories of people who are converted, like Thomas Merton, who ends up leaving the life of New York City, becomes a Catholic, is baptized, and goes to a monastery and lives the rest of his life as a monk and writes these marvelous books. So our tradition is bringing forth stories for us, one after another, that can illumine our own lives. And we begin to think of those people as heroes. We see them as great figures. And we sort of say, why not? To be converted to wholehearted buying into the tradition says, why not? Why couldn't I move in that direction? Why couldn't I have some of that courage, live in some of that light, change my life around? That's part of what all of this would mean. How are we going to do that? Well, I think part of it is being in touch with these stories, studying a bit. I think it helps to know the lives of the saints. It helps to go back and read the Bible from that viewpoint. What does it tell me about my life? And especially then to try to extend those stories to all phases of my life. So maybe it would even remind me of how I ought to be when I'm on the golf course or in a social situation and when I'm doing my job and saying my prayers as well. These stories ought to influence everything about me. That's what it means to be converted, I think, in this wholehearted manner. Let me move to another aspect of this whole thing, which means now that we need to specify this more. We need to talk about Jesus Christ because, as I suggested, we're not just talking about a religious conversion, but we're talking about a Christian conversion. We're talking about all of this as Christian people. And so let me try to describe this a little bit to you about how all of this might fit together. So to be unconverted as a Christian person might be that we have sort of a vague or shadowy notion of who Jesus Christ is. Christ isn't terribly important to me. And if he is important, I see him mostly as an ethical teacher. So I might say, yeah, he was a nice guy, and he had this beautiful idea of love that he taught, and that's sort of a nice ideal, and I might try to live it out. That's sort of the level I find a lot of people at today. I find a lot of young people who are very attracted to Jesus as an ethical teacher. They like that. They think that's a neat way to live. These are good young people I'm talking about, and they really try to go along with all of that. But what I'm going to try to show here is that that is a limited way of saying who Jesus Christ really is. So I'm saying that there's limited or unconverted ways of thinking about Christ, where he either isn't important, he's not part of my piety, I don't really have a personal relationship with him, and maybe I have relegated him to the past as a figure of 2,000 years ago, nice guy, sort of a prophet, ethical teacher, but not much more than that. Now, to become converted as a Christian means that I now hand my life over to Jesus Christ, that I enter into a personal relationship with Jesus, that in a phrase that I like very much, I now bet my life on Christ. I bet my life that Jesus Christ has the key to living. I give myself over entirely to the notion that he had the key, that he had a wisdom about what human existence should be like, that he is the full flowering of what humanity's all about. He's the best that we have produced, the finest example of a mature, with it, zestful, active, constructive human being who has made a great difference in the world. My mentor, Karl Rahner, put it in very personal terms. He said for a lot of his life, Jesus Christ really, was important, but he didn't really have a strong personal relationship with him. He said only later in his life did he get to the point where he could say something like this, that I can throw my arms around Jesus Christ, the risen Lord, in an act of love. That would be a way of saying convert in a Christian. Could I say that I could throw my arms around Jesus Christ, the risen Lord? Now, really raises, I think, a lot of problems for us, and there's a lot of theology that stands behind all of that. We start out with the notion that Christ for us is the final prophet and the absolute Savior, that he had the final word for us, the definitive message from God, has made God's love irrevocable. God's always loved the world. Grace has always been in existence ever since first humans walked earth. But what Jesus Christ did was to concentrate all that, particularize. God's love reached a particular point in Jesus of Nazareth, and he responded so fully, so completely, the love of the Father, that we say that he is God personally in our midst. He's irrevocable and definitive God's love. It can't go wrong now. The final victory is assured. The final word in this world is going to be yes. The good is going to triumph over evil. We know that in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That really is our claim, that he is the one who makes a decisive difference. He made a decisive difference on his disciples. When he walked around and encountered people, they felt different. They felt liberated. They were new people. They had courage and strength. They felt better about themselves. They had confidence now. They went out and made a difference. And the great claim of us Christians is that Jesus Christ does the same thing for us today, that he can change us, liberate us, help us to live in a better way, help us understand the deepest questions of life, to be more responsible people. That is why we would end up saying that we can bet our life on Christ, that he is the risen Lord, that he is present in our world today. He has not abandoned us. He sent his Spirit to be with us. And therefore, he has the key to human existence. His way of loving and doing so in an unconditional manner is the way we should live. His surrendering to the one he called Abba, Father, gives us the example of how we should function. All of that means that we can bet our life on Christ, that we can give ourselves over entirely. So to be converted means to move away from seeing Jesus just in ethical terms, and now being able to see him as the Savior, the Liberator, the Prophet, one who will never be superseded, the one who has planted the seeds of the final victory, the cosmic Lord. All of those various models we have of Jesus would be ways for us to commit ourselves and hand ourselves over. So for us Christians, religion is not just a vague general thing. It's not a philosophy of life. It's an historical religion. The final conversion means that we hand ourselves over to Jesus Christ as the one epitomizing God's love and being the finest example of the human responsiveness to the call of God. Well, we've been talking now about religious and Christian conversion, and it really it's very demanding. I suppose we'd end up saying we can't live up to that entirely. It's always beyond us. It's an ideal, and that's proper. We don't want to get carried away and say we've made it, and we don't want to get down on ourselves. Conversion, made one, opens up doors. Initial conversion leads to a continuing conversion. And if we're to hand ourselves over to Jesus Christ, then it all looks different. Then all the other conversions begin to be seen in a different way. So the affect conversion is possible because, God loves me and he accepts me despite negative emotions that are within me. And I look at the model of Jesus Christ. He shows me how to face emotions and mobilize them for good. Intellectual conversion becomes possible because I know it's important to talk about these matters. I know I have to invest this theology, make it part of mind and heart, so that I witness to it. So I'm intellectually converted because I know it's important to be able to talk intelligently about the deepest matters of life, to be in touch with the world spirit. And I'm morally converted because I see the example of Jesus Christ as a loving person, just tell us to love us, but actually who didn't just say to care for the poor, but reach out to them himself. So here we find all of the conversions coming together. And any other ones we've taken up, like imaginative conversion. Jesus would help convert our imagination to warm and loving images of the great God. So pull all of this together, my final reminder of all of this is that invitation. It's an invitation to look more seriously at our own lives, to ask us deep and probe questions, to do so with great honesty, and to do so systematically. I've tried to give us a framework doing that, guidelines for trying to be more effectively self-aware, so that we move forward in life. I believe there is God who calls us by name, who holds us in the palm of his hand. Even if the mother forget her child, great God will never forget us. And this is the beautiful call, to look honestly where we are now and to say, why not? Why couldn't it be better? And to have some guidelines to do that. And finally, when we look at what could be better, we look at Jesus Christ, the example of the faithful one, the converted one, the man who was totally responsive to the call of God. He becomes our model as we go about this business of responding to the call to conversion.
All rights to these talks are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210.